Okay, we are live. Welcome to Boston Basic Income, the second week of our online Zoom edition. If you are on the YouTube live chat, you can feel free to join our Zoom meeting.
Can they see us on the on Zoom from the live chat or
they
not?
Can see us. Well, we are on Zoom. They can see us on YouTube.
That's what I mean. Yeah, they can see us on YouTube. Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, the topic today is Yang's legacy. So Andrew Yang ran for president with basic income as a central plank on his platform. And we're going to talk about how the conversation surrounding basic income has changed since Andrew Yang ran his campaign. In what ways has it grown, improved? Are we going in some strange directions that we wouldn't have imagined before he came along, that kind of thing. So some of us read an article called Yang is Gone, but we should still talk about giving people free money. So I want to start by going around and getting people's initial thoughts on how Andrew Yang and his campaign have changed the basic income conversation for the better, for the worse, or just changing it at all. So we'll go in order of, I guess in the order we did introductions, which I think is Joan and then Martin and then Eddie and then Elizabeth, Mitchell, and Steve. So
yeah, so he really raised the consciousness about it, I think, considering that other candidates began to talk about it, like Bernie Sanders and I think others too. I don't remember. It became more. It became somewhat normalized, I think, in this election cycle, so that now it's spilled over to the response to the coronavirus, where there's nobody saying it's a bad idea to give out free money to help people through this. Nobody's talking now about giving people money indefinitely, the real basic income, but the fact that they're talking about giving people money, for nothing, is, I think, part of what Andrew Yang has created. I mean, I don't think it came out of nowhere.
Yeah, well, certainly there have been fiscal stimulus, that has been enacted in the past, in response to 2008 and other times as well, where we just kind of send everyone a check, but nobody was kind of associating it with the idea of income before. So that part is certainly new. All right, so Martin, go ahead.
So my impression, and somebody confirm real quick that you can hear me, because I don't know if I have to raise my hand to talk.
Yes, I can hear you.
Great. So just among people I know, I haven't come away from the debate series and the Democratic primary to date with a sense of more people talking about Andrew Yang and universal basic income, and that just obviously that's just me, right? Clearly, he's put forth this idea on a national stage, and I can't think of anybody before him who has put this idea on sort of.
Now you're muted, Martin. You weren't before, but you are now. There you go.
Right, so can you hear me? Yeah. So anyway, what I was saying is I think that Andrew Yang, certainly his candidacy put the UBI on a national stage, where I think to date it had been sort of in the realm of academics and in the realm of sort of social policy thinkers, some economists, and so forth. So I think that that was good, and I'm actually interested in seeing more people conceptualizing the idea of what we're doing today in terms of stimulus would be happening automatically in a in a UBI sort of economy.
Great. Yeah. Eddie, go ahead.
So, so Yang has been actually a really big influence for me. In the last year, following his campaign, got me thinking a lot about some ideas that Alex talks about also. So, for example, Yang talks about breaking the link between human value and economic value, and a lot of these things, like he tries to keep it very simple. So he it's a very short little thing that he says, but the more you think about it, it's similar to Alex's thing about breaking the link between consuming and producing. And the more you think about it, the more there's like a lot of depth, behind that, in terms of, thinking about economics. And, another thing that it's gotten me think about a lot is the after reading Yang's book, The War on Normal People, that really opened my eyes to how badly large sections of the U.S. are doing economically, and has gotten me thinking about long-term cycles, like having to do with the balance between consumption in society and the capital base of society.
Great. Yeah. Elizabeth.
I think similar to what other folks have said, that Andrew Yang definitely helped to sort of normalize the idea of universal basic income as something that is, has shown up in different like political campaigns, both with other presidential candidates adopting it as at least part of the discussion, and then also at more local levels, congressional folks talking about, UBI-like bills. It's made sort of contra Joan's point about the coronavirus stimulus, that feels like is still heavily linked to prioritizing work, that I feel like it's very much framed as like, oh, it's so tragic that people can't be working right now, and so, we should pay them so they don't die, but like once they can go back to work, and we wouldn't want to make it too much or too forever, because then people wouldn't go back to work, and that would be terrible. I am grateful that we're at least talking about, like, gee, when people are not working and that's their only source of income, we should give them some money so they don't die. But it's been a little bit frustrating that a lot of the conversation around it feels very much like oh, it's so tragic that they can't work, and that work is still the primary thing.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there's something wrong with the way we've structured our economy when people not working is seen as some kind of disaster or something like that. Obviously, there's a disaster happening, but the fact that people aren't working, it should only really be a problem if we're somehow not getting the benefit of the output of that work. But for example, if the reason people aren't working is because we don't want to consume certain things during this time, then it's not a problem that they're not working, because it's a consequence of what we want to do as a society to respond to coronavirus. It's just a problem because we're expecting people to get their money from that work. So Mitchell, go ahead.
I think that he's brought the idea of it being universal to the fact that you don't have any qualifiers, there's less bureaucracy.
Yeah. Let's go with Steve.
Yeah, I was pretty surprised that at the beginning of the coronavirus era, it seemed like everybody's first reaction was to send everybody $1,000 check. It wasn't even it was exactly Yang's amount in exactly Yang's process. So I took that as a kind of a success, that was everybody's first reaction. It's of course gotten all more complicated, more bureaucratic since then. But I think that people's new intuition for how to handle a serious problem will remain after the coronavirus era. And if the voters think that, oh, being very poor in America is a big problem, like having a coronavirus threat is a big problem, then they'll remember how they wanted to solve it during the coronavirus time.
Yeah, I think that's right. So Bethany and Derek have showed up since we started. So Bethany, initial thoughts on Andrew Yang's legacy. How has he influenced the conversation around basic income?
I missed some people, so I'm sure this will be redundant with them, but I think the main thing I would say is putting it on the map for so many people as an idea. Maybe it still seems fringe to certain people, but it's certainly more of, it's going to be sort of cached for a lot of regular people as something on the table, not like as fringe as flat earth or something. There was a real political candidate that made it somewhat far that had this idea. So I think that's one big thing, is just making it a little bit more normal, because that's the first heuristic I think a lot of people use in terms of whether to take something seriously, like research it more, dig into it, think about it, that kind of thing. And so to me, I think that's really big, because if you don't get past that hurdle, it's hard to get much farther. And then, I think he also, for some people, I think he was kind of a breath of fresh air in terms of not falling along the kind of warring divisions, either within the Democratic Party or kind of Democrat versus Republican, that a lot of people fall into. So for better or for worse, he kind of associated basic income with that more sort of less aggressive perspective or attitude, and more kind of almost moderate, even though it's not usually thought of as a moderate proposal. So that's an interesting association. I don't know if that will stick, but that could be part of his legacy as well, as opposed to it being associated with the far right, the far left, or something else politically.
Yeah, Derek, initial thoughts on how Yang has influenced the conversation around basic income.
I was going to mention something similar to what Bethany just did, that because we could imagine many possible popularizers of UBI emerging from a kind of existing, left ideological idea space. And Yang kind of wasn't that. He was in this strange centrist type of position somewhere in the middle. And that confused a lot of people. It's interesting to wonder if basic income could have come from what's considered more like the democratic socialist left in America, or if they never would have made that a priority unless someone with this perspective came along.
Yeah, great. I think I agree with pretty much everything everyone has said, and I really think the biggest impact that Yang has had is, what some people mentioned, just the awareness of basic income. And I know, Martin hasn't seen that as much in his experience, but certainly for me, when I start talking about basic income, or when I mention that I work on stuff related to basic income or universal basic income, people know what I'm talking about now, or they have some concept of it. They think, oh, $1,000 a month, Andrew Yang, that kind of thing. There's a starting point. I don't have to necessarily build people up from scratch. And that can be both a good thing and a bad thing, to the extent that the way Andrew Yang thinks about basic income and talks about basic income is different from my own. I have to kind of maybe break down some of the assumptions that people come into the conversation with. It used to just be that there were no assumptions and I had to do all the work. But yeah, so I think that's the biggest thing. More people are talking about it, more people are thinking about it. I don't know that our response or the proposals for the response to coronavirus would have been that much different if Andrew Yang hadn't come along. But certainly in terms of the framing it as something that's related to this idea of basic income, because both are something that involves handing people money directly, and basic income is something that people have recently been discussing because of Andrew Yang. So I think that's a good thing for basic income. Yeah, Mom, go ahead. You got to unmute yourself. Mom, you're muted. You got to unmute yourself. Maybe I can unmute.
I got it.
There you go.
Okay. So, yeah, I was saying, as someone said, even to the even to the exact amount, $1,000 a month, that was in the air, and that was what people seized on. And that came from Yang. I mean, everybody who talks about it sort of starts now with that amount. And even Romney proposed it. I think Romney proposed $1,200 a month. But around the same. So yeah, and normalized, and also it's almost like piggybacking in some ways, like Sanders has done, onto this concept. And to the point about the third way, this kind of centrist political way that Yang established, I think that's why he did not get the nomination, but it's also why he might be more of a lasting figure in politics, because he's seen by both sides as not threatening. I mean, he's not trying to undermine or present or judge. He hasn't got this kind of moral certitude that a lot of candidates on the left do, for better or worse. So that kind of attitude gives him, I think it gives him more play in the world of politics to come.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. I think there are a lot of reasons why he didn't get the nomination. One of them, or the main one, being just that there's so many candidates and only one can get the nomination, and then political outsider status, and I don't know. The third way, kind of moderate approach, maybe is part of it, but I think also the fact that universal basic income was the center of his platform, even if he had been coming from a very left progressive perspective, which maybe to some extent he was, but even if he had talked exactly like Bernie Sanders but had this basic income kind of on top of it, he's still an outsider, and it's still an out there idea, and maybe it's a little bit less out there now that he's kind of paved the way a little bit. But yeah, my hope is that he stays around and continues to promote the discussion of basic income and get more people thinking about it. I'm sure there's some people on this live stream who wouldn't be here talking today if Andrew Yang hadn't done what he did.
Right.
So you guys ready for the first quote from the article?
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's see if I can do a screen share here. Okay.
Oof. Okay.
So let me, there we go.
It's much more legible than last.
Yeah.
Good. Whoops, now we're, okay, there we go. UBI is a policy in search of an ideology, and Yang's ideology lacks the right kind of structural critique. He focuses on the threat of robots automating people out of their jobs as the reason why UBI is the right fix, rather than something much simpler. No one deserves to live in poverty. It's not a mathematical solution, but a moral one.
Ooh.
So this is an interesting quote, and I agree with some of it, and I disagree with other parts of it. So certainly the idea that robots are automating people out of their jobs and this is a crisis kind of plays into the mainstream narrative of the jobs are the thing that's important, and the problem here is that people are losing their jobs, right? Ideally we wouldn't be viewing this as a problem. So, but then the idea that that the argument for UBI should just be that no one deserves to live in poverty, I think that argument is a little bit limited, because the question isn't whether people deserve necessarily a specific thing, but the question I like to ask is, what's the best we can do for people? How do we maximize the benefit that people get from the economy? So yeah, and then the idea that it should be a moral argument rather than a mathematical one. The issue with that is that you can make a moral argument for just about anything. You can make a moral argument for things that are physically impossible, and you can make a moral argument for something that's less than the maximum we can achieve. So instead of arguing for something that's impossible or arguing for something that's less than the best possible outcome, why not just try to find out what the maximum we can achieve is, and argue that, hey, like, let's do the best we can for people. So I don't think, I'm not a huge fan of the moral arguments for basic income, unless your moral argument is as simple as we should do the best for people that we can because we want people to be happy and we like people. Yeah, Eddie, go ahead.
So with regards to the automation thing, I think a lot of people kind of misunderstand that and kind of set up a straw man argument where they say, oh, look, productivity growth is coming down. A lot of economists say this, like Krugman and Dean Baker, and they say, obviously we're not getting automated away, which has some truth to it. But if you look at a longer time frame, automation, one of the things that I learned in the last year is that automation, the term robot, actually came from the early 20th century, like early 1900s. And a lot of people don't realize that during the Great Depression was actually the last time that the term technological unemployment was actually a very big deal. That back in the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, they were very excited about automation of their time, which at that time it was like machinery, industrial machinery. But so this automation thing, I think there's two aspects of it that you can distinguish. One aspect is the AI aspect, the aspect that AI is going to be very big in the future. That's one aspect. But the other aspect is just the aspect of productivity growth overall. And to me, that ties into the fact that society for the last 200, 300 years, we've been building up a larger and larger capital base. And one of the very simple results of that is that labor is less and less central to the economy, but we have not yet adapted, and we're still, as Alex talks about, we're still paying people based on their labor. But the capital base, increasing just makes that less necessary. And so as a result, we have, large sections of the population living in a very rich society who don't have access to income and can't consume. Which makes the whole thing, a little bit, ridiculous, because, the reason you have all that capital is so that you can produce more. But then when people, don't have an income to buy the production, then, you have weird dynamics like what we're seeing now.
Yeah. I like to say that automation is calling attention to the fact that jobs have really always been the wrong way to push money to consumers. Now, certainly you need to pay people in order to get them to do things, but there's no law of economics that says that the amount of money that you need to pay people to get them to do the necessary work somehow matches up with the optimal level of income for consumers, or the optimal distribution of income for consumers. So yeah, I mean, I think one of the dangers of the automation narrative is that we've gotten really good at making up jobs for people to do as an excuse to pay them. So if we keep doing that, I'm sure most of you have heard of federal jobs guarantee. If we have a federal jobs guarantee and everyone's promised a job no matter what, and we'll try to find something useful for you to do, then 20 years from now we can take a look around and everyone's still employed. But the problem is that it might not be obvious, but they're unnecessarily employed, or they're being kept employed as an excuse to pay them, and we don't really see the full benefits of automation. But if you take the Andrew Yang line of argument and you say, there's this big job crisis looming, and then it never comes, then people might say, "Oh, Andrew Yang, you're wrong. We actually don't need a basic income or something like that." So that's one of the dangers. And I like to say that if you have a basic income, it allows the automation and robots to eliminate the jobs we should have been eliminating all along. And the fact that we don't have a basic income is kind of holding us back from being able to achieve the level of leisure that we could really achieve, and the level of productivity too. Because if you're keeping people employed as an excuse to pay them, then you're not employing them productively. So this is kind of, people wonder, why is productivity growth so slow despite all the fantastic technology we have? And this is kind of the answer. It's because we keep people employed anyway. So the amount of output per hour of labor is not increasing as fast as you would expect it to. Does that make sense?
I think,
Yeah, go
I
ahead,
think,
Andy.
yeah, I think one of the things also is that, with the labor market, you have a free, you have a free market there with the demand and the supply. And the thing is that the labor supply never goes down because everyone needs to make a living, whether their labor is needed or not. And so, I think really what happens is, um, if you go back to the Great Depression, one of the things that happened back then was that many of the business people said, "Oh, we've got to keep everybody's wages up, even though prices were going down, even though we're having price deflation going." And so they kept wages up, but unemployment skyrocketed. And I think one of the things that goes on right now is that unemployment was very low prior to this crisis, but wages have been stagnant for 40, 50 years. And so, as a result of not having enough aggregate demand because people don't have enough income, you get very low labor demand. And so the wages get stuck, even though society, I mean, the economy has actually been growing. I think it's like 5 times larger than it was in the 1970s, but, basic workers make the same amount as they did 40 years ago. And so I think that's a big part of the thing is that workers, wage earners, they get kind of pressed against the floor of society by this lack of labor demand due to lack of aggregate demand. It's a self-reinforcing spiral.
Yeah, I think that's generally right. I think, unless we want to completely eliminate all efficiency in the labor market, if we try to push income to people through the labor market, we're not going to get optimal incomes for people. No matter what kinds of things we try, we're not going to get kind of the result that we would get from, saying, "Oh, hey, here's a basic income, and we'll calibrate it to the maximum possible level." And I think, kind of looping this back to Andrew Yang's legacy, I think this is kind of one of the pitfalls of his legacy, is that his message kind of keeps people focused on labor and keeps people focused on automation and that connection between labor and income, and that's kind of like the angle that he approaches the problem from. So when people listen to Andrew Yang, what they're looking for is, "Oh, are robots taking jobs?" Yes, we see specific examples of it, but is it happening at the level of the overall economy? And then you get economists arguing about, whether productivity is going up or not, and it kind of misses the point that this is not what the labor market was for in the first place. So I think that's part of Andrew Yang's legacy that we're going to have to kind of get past in the conversation about basic income in order to really be able to understand the full potential of basic income. Yeah, Mom, go ahead.
Oh, well, a couple of things. First, I disagree a little bit about what she says, that, and what you've been saying, that Yang's focus has been on AI. I mean, it has, but he's also been focused on this kind of humanity forward movement and humanity first. He was talking about, unpaid labor, childcare, caregiving, all of that. Poverty was part of what he talked about too. I think that I didn't read his book, so I don't know how much of that takes precedence. But the focus on automation seemed to me to be more of a political stand than maybe a philosophical one with him. I'm not sure that that's a belief, but I don't think that's his only belief about what basic income could do. That was my first point. The other point was somebody was saying, well, you know, in the future you look around and you see that, well, Andrew Yang was wrong, you know, these jobs really aren't going away, or they aren't going away fast enough. Well, that's because, as you've said, Alex, because we're creating more jobs to replace them, even if we don't need them. Yeah, so that will probably not be proven. Instead, we'll continue to do the replacement instead of looking at, you know, the actual decimation of a certain amount of labor in society. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I don't think there's anything in Andrew Yang's message that you know tells us that we should be. I mean, I guess he says, you know, generally speaking, that technology is good, and you know we shouldn't want to hold it back and that kind of thing. But it's more like sometimes he frames it as it's kind of futile to hold back technology. Like in an ideal world, maybe we could, but we can't. It's this unstoppable force or something like that. Rather than, you know, this is something we should be celebrating, because if we manage it correctly, we get to maximize people's leisure and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So I think you're right that he kind of puts the emphasis on humanity, on people, you know, kind of humanity first, humanity forward, that kind of thing. And I think that's good. And I think that's a good shift away from kind of workers first, workers forward. If you pay attention, or if you've been paying attention to the various candidates on the Democratic stage, you know, all of them are very heavy on, you know, like we need to support hardworking Americans. We need to, you know, make sure that the people who contribute to put the work in get supported by the government, that kind of thing. And this is true kind of in response to the coronavirus as well. I think Andrew Yang was less hammering on the workers first type narrative, and that's a good thing. He did kind of call attention to it a little bit, but not as much as the other candidates were. You know, focusing on people as people, whether you happen to be a worker or not, I think is something that I would like to see shift more in our political discourse and in the conversation about basic income, because basic income isn't about workers so much as it is about people. And you know, forcing people to be workers, or forcing ourselves to think of people as workers, is one of the things that I think is holding us back. Yeah. So anyone have any more thoughts on that particular quote? We could bring up the next one.
Yeah, could I chime in
go ahead.
So I have, it's going to sound a little self-serving or sort of strange, but you know, all of us in this room, I know I should mention I'm now old enough that during senior hour shopping at Stop and Shop, I get to go. Whippy. Anyway. When in 1991, so I was in the first Gulf War, and I was using email from the middle of the Saudi Arabian desert. And okay, yippee! I worked with people who could not. They knew what email was. These are officers, college trained, all this other, right? But they couldn't really understand why I would propose using email rather than simply calling back to Tennessee. So from Saudi Arabia to Tennessee, there's a time difference. My only point is this: email was appropriate for some kinds of communication and not others. But the people I was working with, that was so novel in 1991. And for folks who, you know, Snapchat, WeChat, Instagram, Insta this, Insta that, and all that other sort of thing, it's, you know, how do I teach you how to not remember how to ride a bicycle? You know, like, to go back to 1991 and think about using email from the Saudi Arabian desert to Tennessee, it's hard to describe how different that was. And the UBI, and it particularly, you know, a little bit what I see in this quote, is it's going to be just a real conceptual change, a conceptual shift. This whole idea of what exactly is worthwhile use of people's time. And we define that by jobs or by work. And, you know, and in the future, it may be that we would and should be very comfortable with just sort of conceptually completely rethinking the idea that one's livelihood comes strictly from jobs as we know them today, and anybody not doing that is somehow, doesn't fit. And so in that sense, and I just think in this in the quote, it's for those of us like in a group like this, we can probably sort of imagine, okay, a conceptual shift, okay, I get all that. But when you try to sort of think in terms of that across an entire society, uh, and all I'm offering is my experience in 1991 was something we so take for, I shouldn't say take for granted, but it seems to make so much sense today. For a lot of people, it didn't make sense, and yet it did. It did make sense in 1991, but for a lot of people, that it didn't make sense to them. But today, if you were to ask any of those people, it'd make total sense.
Yeah, it's interesting, and it'll be an interesting question to ask, like 20 years from now, when people look back on this moment in history, or even any moment in history, assuming we have a UBI in place, what are they going to think, about this whole debate? Yeah, and I had one more comment on this quote too, which is, she says that basic income is a policy in search of an ideology, and from my perspective, why do we necessarily want there to be an ideology here? My hope is that basic income can become so obvious to everyone that it doesn't need a political movement, that it just oh well, of course this is what is necessary to make the economy work, and then there doesn't have to be some kind of ideology or something like that. So I don't know if it's always a good thing to have kind of like an ideological or philosophical backing to these kinds of things. So that was just kind of a thought I wanted to throw out there.
Well, if I could just chime in on that, is to simply say that you and I probably don't agree on necessarily everything, but I totally agree with what you're saying. And yet, all I'm adding is that makes sense to you, and that makes sense to me. It's going to be really hard to make that make sense to an awful lot of people. It's just hard.
I think that's a good point. Yeah. Mom, go ahead. You can unmute yourself.
I mean, you say ideology. When you're saying ideology, I think that for Yang, he actually crossed ideological lines, and that's why he appealed to both parties. I mean, you could say that the ideology on the left, he appealed to the idea of lessening suffering, creating more equality in society, income inequality, all of that stuff. But on the Republican side, he also appealed in the sense of streamlining bureaucracy, doing away with unnecessary things that people didn't need to get. And there's a conservative ideology that he agreed with there, but I'm not sure if ideology is the right word, or maybe it's philosophy. I'm not sure what you or she means by ideology, because there's a lot of ideology behind. You can kind of choose your own in a way, basic income.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And I also think that's part of what she's getting at, is that there's like a lot of different ideologies that people kind of argue for basic income. It doesn't necessarily have one kind of unifying message or theme behind it. Right. Andrew Yang certainly had his perspective, which is obviously different from mine. But yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair point. And I agree that maybe if there was kind of a single central line of thinking behind basic income that I wanted to get behind, then maybe I'd be for that. Go ahead, Derek.
And talking to people who consider themselves members of these various different ideologies, I've noticed a curious thing with basic income, that I can almost always, if I put on that hat and try to look at the world through, a socialist lens, or through a capitalist lens, through a conservative lens or liberal lens, can usually find some way in which basic income really helps that person get the things that they're that they care about, like Joan mentioned, the reduction of bureaucracy for a conservative, and helping the poor if you're looking more from a liberal or left perspective. So I agree with Alex, whereas, it's not necessarily a problem that basic income has struggled to find a home, as it were, in one particular ideology, because the moment you do that, you find that it has a home somewhere else. And it's not every economic policy that seems to be true of. There's many tax policies, for example, that you could not say this about.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that can potentially be framed as an advantage for basic income, because in terms of different people's ideologies, they kind of emphasize things that are important about the economy or about society that are important from a certain perspective or from a certain group. And a lot of these perspectives, they maybe conflict with each other, because in the context of a world where people are expected to get their income from jobs, or where we don't have a basic income, then you kind of can't have both perspectives win. But something like a basic income, I think Derek makes a good point. It can support different political ideologies, different perspectives on what you want out of the world, while at the same time not causing that same kind of conflict, because it helps resolve some of those differences. Some of the things that we think we have to trade off, maybe we don't have to trade off as much anymore with the basic income. It's not like as zero sum, like you raise taxes and therefore that hurts the rich and helps the poor, or something like that. Yeah. So let's get on to the next quote. Here we go. Yes, share. I'll get faster at this. Earlier this week, Lisa Miller at The Cut pointed out that the way Yang talks about UBI affirms the stratification between women as caregivers and men as workers. Well, Yang argued that an extra $12,000 would help caregivers stay home with their children, as Miller writes. Yang's UBI plan doesn't recognize that looking after health, education, safety, and success of all the nation's children should be everyone's problem, including the government's, and not just shouldered by the caregiver at home. So I think this is an interesting point, and it kind of it raises the question of what should we expect a given policy to do. So if basic income solves a particular problem, which is getting money to consumers, is it a problem that it doesn't, solve other problems? Is it a problem that it doesn't, address stratification between women as caregivers and men as workers, or something like that? Or maybe it does in some ways, kind of, since it's something that everyone gets, it gives people more freedom and flexibility to have the role that they want, to take on in their lives. I think that's true. But then the question is was Yang's messaging maybe not helpful in that regard? So I think I agree that to some extent Yang's messaging was not helpful here, partly because he framed basic income as paying people to do care work. Whereas I would say, yes, it gives people freedom to do care work, to be caregivers, but you're not being paid for that thing. I would think of, like, I like to separate the labor market. The labor market is paying people to do something else, something other than what they'd ordinarily do. So the basic income isn't paying people to stay home and take care of their kids. It's giving people more freedom to stay home and take care of their kids if that's what they want to do, but they're not being paid to do that, because they could do anything with the basic income. They don't have to take care of kids. They could stay home and play video games too, right? Like the basic income isn't paying for anything specific. Yeah, so let's see. Does anyone have any thoughts about this quote? Yeah, Mom, go ahead.
So
you got to unmute yourself.
You're always muting me, so I never am in the habit of muting and unmuting myself.
You should be in the habit of muting yourself when you're not talking.
I know, you mute me too fast. So anyway, I think that quote was a little bit off target because she was talking about the stratification of male and female work and the government involvement in the raising and caretaking activities. And I don't see, I mean, that's not something UBI is designed for. I mean, UBI, as you said, can be used as a caretaking tool. And I think maybe partly because Yang often used the example of his wife taking care of his autistic child. And that was the message that he gave during his campaign. Oh, you know, that she's not getting anything for that. But that was, I think, that was just a political point. I don't think that he really is suggesting that you should be paid for various kinds of work. I think he really is more in your line with what you're talking about, Alex, and that everybody gets a certain amount of money and they do with it what they need to do with it. And I don't think that that quote made a lot of sense.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that whenever Yang made that point, I was not happy with it.
Yeah.
It kind of rubbed me the wrong way that that he'd be framing it as like the basic income is paying
Yeah.
people whose labor is typically unpaid, and then the idea that there's such a thing as unpaid labor. You know, the whole idea of unpaid labor seems like a contradiction to me, because labor in my mind is when you pay people to do something. So if it's unpaid labor, it's just work that you're doing, and most of the work we do is not paid. Most of the important work that people do is not paid. But you pay people when you need them to do something different, and that's kind of what the labor market is, and what the labor market is for. And then like it opens him up to these types of criticisms too, where the author of this article is still thinking of like she wants everyone to kind of be thought of as workers, or potentially as workers, and everyone needs to care for the children, or it should be everyone's responsibility, or something like that. I don't think that's necessarily true either. It's okay to have a division of labor where some people are responsible for caring for children and other people are responsible for other things, and all of that is fine. The question is whether you want to give people the flexibility to organize that efficiently, or according to what they want to do. And I think that's what basic income allows us to do, or a big part of what basic income allows us to do. But I like to say that I think people talk a lot about what basic income doesn't do, and we can debate about whether basic income doesn't do this or doesn't do that. But I also think it's important to recognize that basic income does something very important, something that's necessary for the economy to function, which is that it gives people money to spend. And if we're not using basic income for that, then we're using other less effective means. So I don't think Yang ever really put it that way. Like he was talking, he never really like came out and said the economy doesn't work the way you think it does, or something like that. He was just saying like, oh, this thing is happening that's causing this disruption, and this is the solution. So he's kind of got kind of a narrow view, well, somewhat broad, but also somewhat narrow view of what basic income does and what it's for. And then he just kind of like tacks on these examples of how it would help in this case, it would also help in this case, it would also help in this case. And that opens him up to arguing about those individual cases. So now this has opened him up to arguing about, whether it's actually good to, kind of think of women as caregivers, or to kind of separate the roles of caregivers or not, where basic income is really more fundamental than that. And to the author's credit here, she likes the idea of basic income, and part of what she doesn't like was just the way Yang was framing it. And I think even though I don't agree with the particular way she framed her criticism, I agree that I would like it to be a little bit different. I would like it to be a little bit more focused on just the basics of basic income, rather than all these examples of all the different things it might do, that kind of thing. But like you said, maybe it's useful politically. But I think the danger with things that are useful politically is they might be useful to some people, and then raise objections with other people, and then it gets harder to see the forest for the trees if you just keep adding trees, right? So yeah, does anyone have any more thoughts about this quote?
Yeah, so I'll chime in just because, and this is sort of a top subject. Um, I raised my son as a single father. His mother lives in another country, not on the North American continent. So my daily routine was pretty busy. I have no family in this area. So I'm kind of like the typical, or I don't know if there's a typical, but I'm a single parent. And but I also had the, call it the good fortune or whatever, to have sufficient income that I could send my son to a private bilingual school from age 3 and all the way through all of his primary education. And so I guess, well, this quote is sort of framing the child care thing. For me, raising my son was not, and how does this put it, everyone's problem. This was the joy of my life, and I'm glad.
Oh, we lost you there, Martin.
So I'm back. I'm not sure what happened. Yeah. Anyway, so what I was saying is that rather than considering raising my son as a problem that I had to solve, it was the joy of my life, and I'm glad I had the kind of personal resources to be able to really enjoy that period of time and to make that sort of one of the most memorable parts of my life. And so the way that it's framed in this quote, it sort of narrow it, which I think that really what UBI can do is enable people to direct their time to things that are meaningful to them, and those things are not necessarily unmeaningful to the economy or to society. Those things can actually be meaningful to society. In this case, it's the way we relate to families and children and that sort of thing. But it's much more universal than that. What and there's research actually to show this as well, that you've given people that sort of flexibility, they respond in ways that are sort of more enriching personally, and are actually, have real.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, yeah, the idea that basic income or any particular UBI plan should be trying to recognize, any sort of anything, I think is a little weird, right? It's not about recognizing social problems or solving particular ones. It's about providing a basic piece of infrastructure, a basic service that the economy needs, in much the same way that universal healthcare is not about recognizing nurses or any like hospital workers or anything like that. It's about providing a fundamental thing that everybody needs in order for our society to operate efficiently. So yeah, I think I agree with the criticism still that that Andrew Yang came out and said it was kind of about this thing or partly about this thing. The idea that that it pays caregivers, but the fact that he made that mistake doesn't mean that we should make a similar mistake by saying that it recognizes that childcare is the responsibility of all of society or something like that. That's not what basic income is for. It's for giving people money. Yeah, and certainly it provides some advantages in flexibility, like Martin is talking about. But it's not about that. It's not about changing the way we think about people's roles in society or something like that, except maybe to the extent that we don't have to assume that people have to be workers anymore to earn their income from jobs. It is kind of about that, or I'd like it to be. Yeah, so let's move on to the next quote here. As he dropped out, he emphasized that universal basic income, his signature proposal of giving every American $1,000 per month, was his campaign's biggest takeaway. So the reason I highlighted this one is because I think there's a lot of people out there who think basic income or universal basic income is $1,000 a month to everyone. Like that's just what it is. So I think part of Yang's legacy is that people have this kind of rigid idea that basic income is a certain amount, or that the amount is calculated based on kind of the concerns that Andrew Yang had, or kind of the affordability that Andrew Yang thought of, or something like that. So I think, you know, in continuing the conversation and building from where we were left with Andrew Yang, we're going to want to make sure that we can broaden that, so people don't think of basic income in this limited way, that it's a specific amount of money or $1,000 a month or something like that. Anyone have any thoughts about that? Yeah, Bethany, go ahead. You got to unmute yourself.
This one and a lot of the other ones, I think, are part of the trade-off between sort of political stickiness or maybe being like a good politician and trying to get basic income right in a broader sense, because $1,000 a month is just like very easy to remember, easy to understand in terms of what you'd be able to do with it, all that kind of thing. So I think that's part of why it was emphasized, for all of those reasons, and yet it has the limitations that you're talking about.
Yeah. So my hope is that you know, all of the people who are inspired by Andrew Yang, now there's an opportunity for everyone to kind of like take a step back and think about maybe broader concepts here. Yeah, Derek, go ahead.
Yeah, I remember during the campaign, this was kind of a sticking point, because you would be caught arguing for this particular amount and then trying to make a justification for why, well, under current conditions, that's not enough for a lot of people to live on, but it's desirable for X or Y reason. It's better than maybe these other programs we have, and you get into this dynamic. But now, ever since he's kind of passed on the torch a bit, and it's not a choice between that or nothing, right? 1,000 basic income or no basic income, I find I'm much more free to be able to immediately talk about basic income as a policy mechanism, as a lever that can be raised to various amounts based on various conditions. And I think that people are more receptive to that, at least certainly the crowd whose primary objection was that's not enough to live on.
Yeah, and Kyle on the live stream says, unpaid work should be compensated. So that raises a bunch of questions. So the first question is why? And then the second question is what counts as unpaid work? If I spend my time, you know, digging a ditch in my backyard and then filling it back in again, is that unpaid work? And does it deserve to be compensated? I think it's simpler to think of the labor market as just a market for paying people to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do. So most of the work we do, we just do, you know, in our daily lives. You know, we do the things we need to do to live our lives, and that's just normal work, and it's not controversial, and you know, nobody pays us, and that's fine. And then jobs come in, and the labor market comes into play when we need people to do something different. So when you say something like unpaid work should be compensated, I guess you have to be able to answer the question of what counts as unpaid work in this definition, and then why should it be compensated and how much? What's the purpose of the compensation? Because normally the purpose of the compensation is to provide an incentive for people to do the work. People aren't going to do the work unless you pay them to do it. So you know, the idea. You know, obviously one of the problems we have in our society is that we're expecting everyone to get their money from jobs. So we use economic policy to create jobs and boost people's incomes and that kind of thing. But if we weren't doing that, if we had a basic income that was high enough, then the expectation would be that you'd get your income from a basic income, and you'd only do work for someone else if they paid you enough to make it worth your while, right? So think about the statement, just kind of the blanket statement that unpaid work should be compensated, and what the implications of that are. Yeah, Eddie, go ahead.
So One of the things that I think a lot of people don't realize nearly enough is that it's not just the $1,000 in your pocket. That's that's the primary effect. But I would argue that the secondary effect of everybody having an additional $1,000 per month to spend is gigantic. Is even bigger than that. There's a spending multiplier involved here, where people, when they get this money, they'll go out, spend it in the economy. It goes to somebody else who can spend it again. I've seen that number. I've seen estimates of 2 or even 3, which would mean that the income of the average American might go up, not by $12,000 a year, but by 24 or $30,000. And it's very much, it's not just putting more money in people's pockets. To me, it is exactly what the economy lacks, exactly what the economy needs. And part of that benefit is that when you add when you add consumption, when you add aggregate demand, aggregate spending into the economy, that will boost labor demand, which will boost wages. And in addition to boosting wages, what that does is it actually incentivizes companies to grow productivity, to invest in the capital and the improvements that will increase productivity growth. So you get the aggregate demand increase gives you wage growth, and the wage growth will give you productivity growth, which will increase will increase the amount of money that companies have, again, to hire even more. So it becomes a positive spiral that I call the paradox of abundance, and it would fix the problem of productivity growth stagnation that a lot of economists have been looking at for years. And if you look back to the post-Great Depression period, after you put in FDR and after you limited the labor supply by reducing the work week to 40 hours, and the wages started growing again, then that paradox of thrift actually works in reverse also, where better wages gives you more aggregate demand, which gives you better wages, and at the same time also spurring productivity growth and production. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. When people say $1,000 isn't enough, it's really tempting to say, well, wait a minute, it's not just $1,000. Everyone around you is getting $1,000 a month. Everyone's a potential customer. It stimulates the economy. More people might, are going to get hired. You're going to have more ways you can sell things. There's lots of ways. Like $1,000 is just the basic income, but the base, that goes into the economy, and it can, it's going to boost people's incomes in a lot of other ways. So that's a really good point, and it's true, right? It's not just going to be $1,000 a month for most people. But then once you've made that argument, now like Derek said, you're getting sucked into the trap of defending that particular amount. So it's a tricky thing, because you don't want to defend $1,000 because $1,000 might not be optimal, but also the criticism that people levy against the amount of $1,000 it feels somewhat frustrating and unreasonable, because you're not talking about a world in which people are only getting $1,000 extra per month. It's more than that, because people spend that $1,000 and other people are the beneficiaries of that spending. So that's true as well, and it's a really good point. So Kyle on the live stream says, yes, you should be compensated for any kind of unpaid work. I guess he's including the digging a ditch and filling it back in again. And he says, I think of UBI as compensation for all the work you have to do just to live your life outside of your job. So that's an interesting point. But the question is, why are you thinking about it that way? Why does it have to be compensation for something? Like why isn't it a good idea just to hand people money for free that isn't compensation for something if it makes them better off? It seems to me like if you're kind of in your mind, you're thinking people should only get money if they deserve it or if they're being compensated for something, then you have to kind of create this extra level of justification for why people should get a basic income. But if you start from the assumption that we're all human beings and the idea of the economy is to benefit human beings as much as possible, then the basic income, it doesn't have to be compensation for anything. And I think that's a simpler framing, that it's just free money for everyone so they can participate in the economy as consumers, so they can have the means of consumption to benefit from the economy. Then John Crab 67 on the live stream says, for me, the idea of UBI isn't about paid work or unpaid work. It's a mechanism to keep people from falling through the cracks and give them a chance to succeed. So I mean, that's another interesting framing, but the question is, what do you mean by succeed? I mean, the economy exists for our benefit, and UBI gives us the means to receive that benefit. It doesn't need to be more complicated than that. Society as a whole succeeds when people are as prosperous as possible. An individual person spending their basic income, we shouldn't necessarily expect them to turn that into something or to use that money to kind of make something of themselves or produce something or something like that. The production is only there to serve the consumer. So I'm not sure I would agree with that framing either. I mean, it's as simple as giving people money so they can buy stuff. That's what basic income is, and that's what it's for. And the whole point of the economy is to produce stuff for people to buy. So you've got these two sides of the same coin. Eddie, you have your hand up. Is that from before, or do you have another comment? I will lower your hand. Okay. Anyone have any comments on this quote about basic income being $1,000 a month?
Yeah, so I just wanted to, when I said that, at least around the people that I run into, there wasn't as much discussion about UBI, even though I acknowledge that that Yang's candidacy certainly put it on a national stage. I did have an interesting, in fact, I invited this individual to join this this evening, but I don't, maybe she is. The individual is just a very sort of passing acquaintance, but she grew up and was educated in China, earned her PhD there. Then she was a fellow at the Kennedy School. And I don't know exactly what she does today, but I think she's a professor. She does some teaching or maybe teaching and work in, I'm not going to call it retirement planning. I'm not thinking like individual, but more like from the standpoint of how retirement figures into an economy and sort of more from that level. And she made the comment that the sort of favorable to Yang and UBI, and that the concept of UBI was something that they learned, they being Chinese growing up when she did, as part of their communist education. And that I found was sort of interesting, only because I'd never heard of that sort of concept. And my education included quite a bit of education in Soviet communism. Makes me think of, however, is the idea of $1,000 a month. I would always offer that there's already a basic income out there on one end of the sort of the income spectrum in the form of dividends paid on dividend paying stocks, and people having trust funds and wealth management plans that include stocks that pay dividends. And what is a dividend? Well, it's sort of a payout against the growing
Yep, we lost you there, Martin.
Yeah, so it looks like that's somehow on my end. I'm not sure what's kind of going on here. All I was going to say is that you can almost say there's a notion of basic income, not universal by any means, on people who earn substantial parts of their income from dividends paid on dividend-paying stock. And if you could think of conceptually stock across the entire economy and everybody owning that stock that pays dividends, then how much income there would be sort of a function of the overall performance of the economy. It would also, for people who hold stocks that pay dividends, dividend payment is something that it may go sort of up or down, but it doesn't happen sort of at the second. A dividend is announced, and you can sort of, what I'm offering is just sort of a notion of a mechanism where that basic income is not tied necessarily to a very specific amount, but it is sort of related to the overall functioning of the economy, and it is paid out like a basic income in that you have a reasonable expectation that it's a steady stream of payments, and then you conduct your personal financial life based on that expectation, based on having expectation of a certain amount of money to spend that is coming in, and it's.
Yeah, I think that's basically right. And there are people who frame basic income as a kind of universal dividend. Certainly, Andrew Yang did. He called, his basic income the freedom dividend. And conceptually, the idea was that we are all kind of owners and shareholders in the economy. So I think that's, it's an interesting analogy. Again, I think it's one of these things where you kind of use this framing, or we use various different framings to kind of justify it, like why people deserve it. Like people deserve it because we are owners, or people deserve it because it's compensating them for something, or like that kind of thing. And I think these are just kind of mental hoops that we jump through. It doesn't need to be framed as a dividend. It doesn't need to be framed as compensation or anything like that. It's just about again, about giving people access to the economy, and the economy exists for us. So I think if someone is stuck and they need to figure out why people deserve this money, then you can kind of go through these hoops and frame it in this way. But my preference is to keep it simpler than that and just say we're handing people free money. It's a government handout for free. Eddie, go ahead.
So I really like the framing of saying that it's basically a dividend, and I think one of the really interesting things is that if you kind of open your mind about what money is, because part of what money is the goods and services that you can buy with the money, and then a different part of money is when you say wealthy people have a lot of money, what they really have is generally ownership of capital, the means of production. And so when you're providing this UBI to people, and it's a dividend on society, it's part of what you're doing is you're giving them you're giving them the dividend. How to say this? You're giving them the access to the dividend on the capital in terms of the goods and the services that it produces. Does that make sense? Right. Yeah. You're giving because the whole point of the capital, the whole point of all that capital is to produce more goods and services. But the funny thing about society right now, about this point in time, this era, is that you have too much capital and not enough money in people's pockets, not enough consumption. And so you're not getting the dividend. You're not getting the goods and services that you could be getting because people don't have the money to buy it. And because people don't have the money to buy it, what you have is businesses, they're not investing anymore in more capital.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Because people, so you have all this idle capital just running around looking for something to do, they can't invest in more production because nobody can buy it, and so it just goes into stock markets and bond markets. And it's very interesting that a lot of people think that interest rates are very low because the Fed makes them very low. But on the other hand, there's also a lot of reasons to believe that it's not just that. It's also, a lot of economists talk about a savings glut, and to me, this is a consequence of having too much capital, not enough consumption. So there's no reason to. So you have that savings glut. There's no reason to invest in more equipment. So it just runs around looking for something to do and drives interest rates down, 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 and down.
Yeah, I think
It
that's
makes
right.
bubbles.
Yeah, and it forces when people aren't spending enough money, it forces the Fed to allow interest rates to go really, really low. If they had wanted to, they could have released a bunch of treasuries onto the market and driven up yields and that kind of thing. But they're not going to do that because consumer spending is below where they want it to be. So it's kind of both. I mean, the people who blame the Fed, they can blame the Fed, but the Fed doesn't really have a choice. They have to let interest rates go down because of the savings glut, and there's not enough consumer spending to actually activate the real productive capacity of the economy. So it's kind of all of that together. Yeah, Bethany, go ahead. Bethany? Yeah. You should unmute yourself.
I keep clicking it, but this is in relationship to what you were talking about. Well, basically it's in relationship to all the different framing discussions we've had where people say, I like to frame it this way. And you're like, well, but why frame it that way? I guess my question to you is, do you think that your way of framing it would be the most politically expedient if you were trying to go a political route, or would there be another one? And I guess the second part of that question is, even if it's not the most expedient, do you think it would avoid the most kind of like problems in the long term? Yeah, both of those in terms of going, if you were trying to go the political route like Andrew Yang was.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. And Andrew Yang, of course, was trying to go the political route. In terms of political expediency, maybe those types of framings are better. Maybe robots are taking everyone's jobs is, a way to get everybody's attention, get everyone thinking about basic income. But I'm, personally, from my perspective, I'm less interested in the political side of things, and I'm more interested in the intellectual side of things. So there's plenty of, momentum, especially thanks to Andrew Yang. There's plenty of political momentum behind basic income right now. My hope is that the intellectual momentum can catch up to where the political momentum is. Before Andrew Yang entered the race, or around the time when he entered the race, I was thinking to myself that basic income isn't ready for politics because people haven't figured out a lot of this stuff yet, or a lot of the mainstream economists haven't figured out how the economy works and how basic income fits in. Right. And I think to some extent I was right, but also, I was also very, very wrong because Andrew Yang made a huge positive difference, and there are a lot more people thinking about the intellectual side of things since Andrew Yang, and that's obviously good for everyone, and it's good for the side of the discussion that I care about too. So I think I'm kind of dodging your question a little bit, but it's also because I'm not as interested in the political expediency, and I'm more interested in getting the intellectual side of things right. And I kind of have this faith that if we understand basic income, and if we understand it at its most simple, basic level, then it'll become obvious to the people who are thinking about it from the intellectual perspective, and that in itself is going to help boost the political side of things as well. Does that make sense?
It does. Yeah, I think it still raises interesting questions about how the two do or don't talk to each other. Like you said, like it doesn't even seem like you necessarily need total economic backing to at least start to have the conversation politically. But also when there is economic backing, I wonder if the political message tends to follow that and be somewhat consistent with it or not. Yeah, so it just raises interesting questions there for me.
Well, it depends. I mean, if all economists agree that basic income is a necessary piece of economic infrastructure, then it's going to be hard for the politics to push back against that.
Right.
The danger, of course, with the Andrew Yang approach of politics first is that then you get into all these political arguments. Is the VAT regressive? Is the fact that people have to opt out? Is it really taking something away from people who already have it? Or like there's like is it about what people deserve? Is it about workers? Is it about robots taking jobs? Are the robots really going to take the jobs? Then you get into all these arguments, which really don't matter at all when it comes to thinking of basic income at an intellectual level, or at least the way that I like to think about it. So my hope is to kind of rise above all of that and provide an intellectual foundation that can then can be used on the political side, or maybe just make it so obvious to everyone that, like, of course, this is what we should be doing. Yeah. Martin, go ahead.
Yeah, so I was just going to say that what I'm sort of discussing in terms of sort of this notion of a dividend, I don't approach that as framing. I approach it as there are already people who own stock portfolios and they earn income, which in the form of dividends on their stocks, and we're all perfectly comfortable with that. I mean, notionally, nobody says that these people are doing anything wrong. So I conceptualize this sort of fourth industrial, just as a thought experiment, but a fourth industrial economy that it's all robots. It won't really be, but as a thought experiment, it's all capital in the forms of AI, robots, production, blah, 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 blah. And the companies that are doing the production, the services and material production, are doing this with 100% capital. And the profit on doing that comes back to stockholders, shareholders, in the form of a dividend. And that dividend is available to those shareholders to consume. And if everybody's a shareholder, you could have a functioning economy that way. And then, of course, the question is, well, okay, but how does everybody become a shareholder? And all I would offer is that in the fall of the Soviet Union, there was a process that attempted to achieve just that. It was a disaster, but there is at least a historical precedent for making that change.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point. To me, it still feels like political framing when we say, yes, we're okay with people who receive dividends, like that's an okay thing. So then if you frame this as a dividend, then maybe you can kind of extend that social acceptance into a basic income because it's also a dividend or something like that. And that's not to say that it's a bad idea. It does feel like an extra layer of complexity to me. And I guess part of the reason is that the amount of the dividend that gets paid out is kind of determined. Well, I mean, it's determined somewhat arbitrarily, but it's related to the profitability of the company and that kind of thing. Whereas the amount of the basic income that gets paid out it's really kind of determined in the other way. It's how much spending can the economy as a whole handle, which is maybe you can frame that as that's like the amount of profit that the productive businesses and things can absorb. So it could be related in that way. But yeah, I don't know. I think you're right. It's still not appealing to me to think of basic income as a dividend. Eddie, go ahead.
So talking about the political expediency, I read somewhere, and I think I've observed this, that politicians, they tend to not get much done until a crisis happens. And then when a crisis hits and it's a big deal and there's a lot of pain out there, then they get their act together and do something. And I suspect that in the next few years, we're going to see a lot more economic pain, and there's a good chance that we do end up with UBI eventually, as that happens, and that we just haven't had quite enough pain. Like, politicians right now are a little bit scared, but they're not quite scared enough. But I suspect it'll happen in the next few years, and so I think it's a really great time to put the intellectual framework together right now, so that when the politicians finally wake up and say we really need to do something, we have something very solid to explain. This is why a UBI would work perfectly right now.
Yeah, I think there's truth to that. My hope has always been that it wouldn't require a crisis in order to make this happen. But certainly, once the crisis happens, if you have something like a basic income that people understand and can turn to, then that's a great opportunity to do the kinds of things we should be doing anyway. And we're seeing that a little bit with coronavirus. I think kind of like we were saying earlier, the pandemic is making it obvious that jobs are a cost, or many of the jobs are a cost, not a benefit. Like we don't want people going out to work. And I would argue that that is true most of the time, that we would only want people going out to work to the extent that it actually is, necessary or useful for the economy. But now, when it's physically dangerous for people to go to work, that's becoming clearer and more obvious. So now we're actually defining, which businesses are necessary businesses and which jobs it's necessary for people to still go to, and which ones, we want people to stay home from. But I would say that this is something that's kind of always true, and the coronavirus is just calling attention to that. So there is a kind of an extent to which the current crisis is bringing some of these things up to consciousness. Yeah, Bethany, go ahead.
So I just wanted to point out that you keep mentioning like it's simpler to say this, or like I don't like to have a political framing, but sometimes I think that's because your framing, which I think would be considered political to a lot of people, just feels really obvious to you. So for example, like your political framing is that like everyone deserves to be as prosperous as possible, independent of their contribution, which is actually pretty controversial and like is quite a political framing, I think, from a lot of people's perspective. And that's the foundation of how you think about justifying a basic income. To you, it seems obvious, like, of course, we want people to be as well off as possible. And I don't really care, about like moral desert. I care about incentivizing work that makes everybody more prosperous, but not moral desert, speaking as you, right? So I think that just stands out to me as you respond to other people's framings, that you also have one that could be stated explicitly and is behind how you think about basic income.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. We'll go to Derek now.
That's your only response to my point?
Nice. Well, I'm going to try to elaborate on that a little bit. I mean, I think earlier in the conversation, Alex mentioned how briefly he said that, well, if there is a moral assumption here, it's as small as possible, meaning saying that, well, we're going to say that people ought to receive the benefit of their economy. Why not? And I think I would agree with you, Bethany. I would think it's fair to identify that as a kind of moral assumption. We can imagine, and I've debated people that don't have that assumption, that basically humans have no innate value. Some people do believe this, pretty rare. But the difference then between a moral assumption and a political foundation, I think, is interesting. And there seems to be some overlap there. And it makes me wonder kind of what politics really is and what we mean when we say we're advocating for something politically. It seems to me that when I'm talking to people about basic income, my goal is to convince them of the idea, of the attractiveness and the usefulness of the idea. And I'm perfectly happy to convince a Republican, a Democrat, any member of any political camp. And I noticed that whatever it is that people are doing when they're engaging in politics, I'm not sure if it's that. I'm not sure if they're interested in sharing an idea, or trying to share an idea with someone else. It seems to me that it actually may require the prevention of that, some of what we call politics today. So that's sort of what I think of when I think about the difference between maybe a moral assumption, maybe a minimum moral assumption, and a political ideology or a political worldview.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And there is some evidence actually that people often frame moral arguments in terms of their own values instead of the other person's, which is not as effective for persuasion. And I think in politics, a lot of times people are doing that. They're talking about their own values, not really trying to persuade other people. And in terms of what a political framing is, yeah, I guess I was thinking of it in very fundamental terms, like what's the justification for doing this? But you could also think of it more as aligning yourself more or less with one of the sort of compilations of ideologies that are already out there in a political camp, which maybe this author is implicitly thinking about when she says that Andrew Yang needs a political framing. Yeah, I do think though, Alex, that making your justification, whatever you want to call it, explicit is maybe helpful, because a lot of people are, it seems to me like a lot of the justifications people are giving in all discussions are implicitly coming from a place of assuming that you have to justify the kind of moral desert for giving someone money. And so if you state yours explicitly, it also makes explicit that that's where they're coming from. And then you can have a conversation about that kind of foundational difference. And maybe they don't even really believe that once it's brought up explicitly, but it's implied in how they're coming up with creative ways to explain the moral desert of basic income. So that's partly why I think it's useful to acknowledge your justification as well in conversation with the other ones that we're talking about.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. You know, when I think about moral desert, and I think you probably agree with me on this, you know, I think about it as a social incentive, right? So the reason why we have this sense of who deserves what is to provide an incentive for people to contribute in certain ways and that kind of thing, an incentive to cooperate, to kind of do the right thing that's you know, benefits the society and all of that. So I don't think of kind of moral desert as kind of like the fundamental thing. I think of it as a social, kind of a internalized social incentives, which obviously you actually know more about than I do. But yeah, so I guess my foundational kind of, I guess, political perspective isn't necessarily that people just deserve things for being human necessarily. It's more that it's more a question of why do we have an economy in the first place? So I guess you could say there are some people, for example, who don't believe that all people deserve benefit. They only believe, you know, maybe their in-group deserves the benefit of the economy, or maybe they think it's perfectly fine to have a slave underclass or something like that. And I don't believe that. But even if you do kind of think of the world in that way, that, you know, there's other people who deserve to be poor or something like that, you do have your in-group, and that in-group does have an economy, and maybe it's supported by robots, maybe it's supported by slaves. And if you're trying to ask how does that economy efficiently serve the group of people who, you know, kind of it's designed to serve, you know, basic income is the answer to that question in terms of giving people the means of consumption.
Yeah, but I think many people are not, maybe they hold partly that view that it's there to provide prosperity for people in aggregate, but they also hold the view that payment is in relationship to contribution or something like that. And they hold them maybe simultaneously, and they might actually conflict, but people aren't necessarily aware of that kind of thing. But I think that other view is very prominent as well. And you're still, even for the in-group, taking for granted that they're going to be thinking of the economy as something to, within the in-group, kind of evenly distribute benefit, or at least just not try to give some people more for no reason other than, you know, that it's better for the whole economy or something like that. And that is not how people think about it.
Right. I guess if I were to ask people what they think the role of the economy is, I think most of them would say, you know, for increased efficiency of trade and specialization to provide, you know, benefit for society, whatever society they care about. So if you kind of start from that perspective, I don't know that
they start that way if you ask them that question, but then other times, like when you ask them why should people have a basic income, that's not where they're starting from a lot of the time. So they don't always start from that perspective, is what I'm saying.
Well, usually when I ask people why, you know, people should have a basic income, or why shouldn't they have a basic income, then they respond with, you know, whatever they're going to say, and then I say, well, why do we have an economy? So I usually get to that question.
Well, you're sort of steering. Anyway, I don't want to take up too much time, but this was some of my thoughts on why it's useful to make explicit kind of where you're coming from.
I think it is. I think I just have to be careful to make it explicit in a way that doesn't attribute some kind of kind of moral perspective that goes beyond just the point that I'm trying to make. Like I'm not trying to make the point that everyone's equal or we should treat everyone equally, even though I kind of do have that perspective. I think basic income is still important for an efficient economy, even if you believe there should be a slave underclass or something like that. Basic income for the people who aren't slaves or whatever, right?
It's true, but within some group, you kind of treat everybody equally. You at least have to like define a group parameter in which people.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And I think that's not what people are used to thinking about, and it is kind of feels political to a lot of people. Anyway, I mean.
Yeah. Well, I think these are all really good points, and they're points that Andrew Yang and his message don't really necessarily bring up to consciousness right away. So this is one of those things where we can kind of take the momentum that Andrew Yang built and then extend it into these kinds of conversations, which I think is a good thing.
You see Andrew Yang doing this, like trying to recognize or deal with the fact that people want some kind of desert-oriented justification, I think. And that's some of what we've been talking about, like unpaid labor and like a dividend, and and he kind of just has like a few, because people feel this way so intuitively.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think he probably does too. I don't think he's kind of like outside it and trying to, politically manipulate people's psychology and stuff like that. I think he's in it. He's feeling that way as well.
I think so. Although to Joan's point, his humanity first angle is a little closer to how you would think about it. Not so desert.
Yes, that's a good point. Although part of me wonders if the humanity first angle is like humanity before robots or something like that.
Or before
it's
the
not like
coffee, or I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think to some extent it's all of humanity, not specific groups of people, but it's also like we care about people, like it's not about doing the best we can for machines. It's about people, put the people before the robots, that kind of thing. So I think it works at multiple levels, or it tries to work at multiple levels. Yeah, so let's get into one more quote. Yeah, here's a good one. Share. Yang's specific version of UBI was rightfully critiqued by many on the left, who saw it as tackling the back-end issues of poverty without actually pushing to dismantle the root capitalistic powers that are fucking people over in the first place. So that's spicy right there. So was it rightfully critiqued for this reason? I don't think it was. I mean, like the back end issues of poverty. I guess for me, it's addressing a specific problem. There's something that's specific, that's broken in the economy, and basic income fixes it. And maybe there are some social issues that Clio Chang would like to see brought into the basic income conversation, but I'm not sure that they're necessary. I think this is another one of those examples of, but it doesn't do this thing, even though what it does do is really important. So Derek, go ahead.
This is a question of causation. They have a model of causation for what they consider to be the undesirable features of today's economy. So poverty is, their model appears to be that poverty is caused by capitalist exploitation. That can be, examples of that they could give are rich people collecting a lot of profits off the backs of the workers. And if that is what you believe is causing it, right? If that's what you've studied it and you've come to those conclusions, well, it would seem to you that giving consumers more spending money doesn't solve the problem. And many people argued this. I mean, Marx argued that very explicitly. And so the problem would be, I suppose, if it turned out to be the case that actually no, just lack of money caused those problems, and that this was a separate issue from inequality. And when people talk about something being the back end or the front end of the problem, that's sort of what they're talking about they have a model of what must happen. Causation is about what must happen. And so if they think that inequality is causing the exploitation and the poverty, then adding a basic income must do nothing, right? Because it's inequality that is causing it. So this is really a question of causation, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I like the way you put that. Bethany, go ahead.
My point was really similar, actually. So like one initial reaction I could have to that quote is, well, poverty is the lack of money, and this is the most direct response you could give to that. But I think I was also trying to be, what would be the really charitable view of the alternative, like Derek was saying. And it might be something, another way to think about that alternative might be something like, there's a group that has an interest in keeping people poor and the power to do it. And so you try one thing and they're just going to compensate it with another thing. And that's actually not such an unreasonable perspective. I mean, I don't necessarily agree that that's all that's going on, or that would fully outweigh basic. I don't agree with that at all. But if you have that model, like Derek was saying, then it is a real critique. I don't know if it was that sophisticated, kind of where people were coming from with this critique of Andrew Yang, or if it's more what we were talking about before, which is people want to make sure they signal what their political camp is. And they already have a political camp, and they just are showing that by saying basic income isn't in mine yet, or whatever. So I think it's probably more with that, but it's also possible that you could have the kind of model that Derek and I articulated. And that is different from what you're saying, which is like, it's going to solve one problem and then we have to solve other problems. Because their point is it would be compensated for, because like people want to keep, some class of people like has an interest in keeping people poor. That would be the argument there. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. So she might see it as, well, you're throwing money at this problem that's really not caused by money. It's caused by rich people wanting to keep poor people poor, or capitalists wanting to keep workers poor, or something like that. Or racists wanting to keep Black people poor. Or I guess I could keep going, but I won't. So we're getting toward the end. Let's get people's final thoughts. We'll start with my mom, since she has her hands up.
Okay. Well, just going back a little bit to what you were talking about, the root causes, this idea of root cause. I mean, it's interesting to think that it's not a trivial idea that people will want to connect some kind of ideology or moral cause with basic income. I mean, and it's not something to scoff at. I mean, actually, I wonder if we're not all connecting some kind of moral justification for it underneath, saying, well, yeah, it's just money. Because really, thinking about something like racism, it isn't really solved just by money. Just like segregation wasn't able to be enforced just by laws, as people wanted it to be, because there was a deep psychology there that couldn't be moved. And so I think that it's a little oversimplified to think of basic income as just money that then will be a solution to a lot of the problems that we're experiencing. I think we do have to think about some of the problems as problems separate from whether or not you get money to alleviate it. But
yeah, I think that's right. I would just say that basic income solves the money problem to the extent that people's lack of money is being caused by some of these other things.
Yep.
But it doesn't change people's hearts and minds. It might create the conditions that allow people's hearts and minds to change, but that's a different thing.
Yeah, that's
so
true.
I think that's a good point.
Like the laws against segregation allowed some people to change their minds and hearts because they were forced to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's right. So let's go to Elizabeth, and then Mitchell, and then Eddie.
Thinking about sort of some of the stuff that people had raised earlier about how Andrew Yang's like $1,000 a month sort of came to like define what UBI is. That feels like that's potentially connected to this critique of like, oh, it's not really solving poverty because it's not getting to that sort of higher level of like, oh yeah, people could really like flourish on this in the way that you talk about UBI as like, oh, what do we have the productive capacity to offer to people? What's the most that we could do? And so if the definition of UBI is just like, oh, well, it's $12,000 a year, that it's like, okay, well, that feels like a minimal anti-poverty mechanism, but doesn't feel like it's really getting at root causes, even though, as you rightly point out, it technically is getting at the root cause in the sense that people are definitionally less poor if you have given them more money. But, you know, in the same way that it's sort of like, oh, okay, you're like bleeding and we like put some stuff so you're bleeding less, you know, but we're not really like effectively doing this. So it's like, okay, we've sort of fixed it, but not really.
Yeah. So let's go to Mitchell.
All right, I think his book has brought awareness, and also him being on the debate stage. And yeah, I think I'll leave it at that.
Okay, we'll do Eddie, and then Martin, and then Bethany, and then Derek. Go ahead, Eddie, if you're there. All right, Martin, you're up.
Yeah, so to the last quote there, I think everybody wants to drop the F-bomb, and you just got to create that chance to do it. My other observation there, what was the language that he used is, oh, I shouldn't have scrolled up because now I don't see it. But anyway, the language of pushing to dismantle. And personally, I'm more of a building to create or building to a future rather than, talking about what we need to dismantle. The dismantle part gets all taken care of when you're building something to replace it. And my only other thought on this sort of the notion of the dividend, those shares that pay a dividend, they actually also typically give the shareholder something else, which is the right to vote. And that right to vote can be things like voting what that company, if it's an energy company, how that company acts with respect to climate change, how that company acts with respect to CO2 sequestration, and making that investment. And so it's, to my way of thinking, it's also kind of inherently democratic. And if it's across the entire economy, the entire populace, that's the kind of thing I'm in favor of.
Okay, Bethany.
Yeah, so what was I going to say? I think I'm still interested in this question of political or ideological framing with respect to what Andrew Yang brought up. And I think that people need to connect something with something that they care about. And I guess I'll just push on you again a little bit, which is that I think making the idea of making the economy more efficient immediately connects to you with things like people are better off, they have more freedom, they have more possibilities, they're not, all the things that come with poverty are helping to be alleviated. Like there's so much that's good. But I think the standard person thinks economy, and this is almost what Andrew Yang was pointing out with Humanity First, thinks it's somehow disconnected from making people better off. Like the very fundamental assumption that you make is just not being made in their minds. It's like, oh, how the economy is doing has to do with like the stock market, or maybe some like figures of unemployment rate, or maybe like how the uber wealthy are doing. But how the economy is doing is not really about poverty or quality of life. I think it is. I agree with you, but I think making that connection is part of the framing that really would need to happen if someone were advocating outside of academic circles where that assumption is clear, and inside of kind of like political circles like Andrew Yang was trying to do. To just making sure people understand that the economy is their lives and other people's lives being better. The economy doing better is people doing better. That's obvious to you, but it's not always so obvious to people, I think, when that rhetoric is used. I think it should be in a way, but it's because we haven't always connected those. We don't have a basic income. People don't prosper necessarily when the economy is doing better all the time. I think it can be hard to connect them. Yeah.
Cool. All right, Derek, go ahead.
Yeah, I agree with what Bethany just said. And I think that the overall legacy of Andrew Yang there will really be two things. I mean, number one is basic income. And he's brought that into the limelight. And that's an enormous accomplishment just from a pure economic perspective, in the way that Alex often likes to talk about it. But the second thing that Andrew Yang did that caught my attention was this this other thing that we can call humanity first. And it is novel. And the idea that connecting those two things, that the economy should be serving people first, as opposed to second, right, or later down the chain, that is novel. And I think it's interesting that it's novel. I think it's interesting that we have had political parties organized about things other than that for a very long time. And I am interested to see how that develops, how people look at Andrew Yang, not just as the popularizer of basic income, but as the first kind of politician in the mainstream to offer a vision that did not fall into the clean left-right categories, and that was organized around this very simple idea, which is just people come first.
Yeah, it is interesting. And, you know, the idea that people come first, not just further down the chain, but also the idea that thinking of people as beneficiaries of the economic machine before we think of them as inputs to the economic machine, I think is a big part of kind of where we can go from here. So Jay Gannon on the live stream says there is a cultural component as it fosters unity. Check out Ken Wilber's model for understanding the multidimensional nature of development. So I don't know what that is, but we can check it out. I think Andrew Yang, yeah, basically what I said before, I think it's an opportunity for us to build on the intellectual discussion of basic income. There's a lot of buzz and everybody everywhere wants to talk about it, which wasn't true a few years ago. So this is fantastic. The political momentum hopefully will keep going, and we're going to keep going at Boston Basic Income. Next week, the topic is going to be war and war finance. So I haven't created the event for that yet, but I will, and looking forward to seeing everyone next week.
Bye, guys.
Alex, thank you.
Thanks, Alex.
Great. Bye.